Hey guys, how's it going?
Yeah, we're good. In
Yeah,
lockdown.
yeah, in lockdown, all that. It's very exciting, isn't it? Well, to all the guys sitting at home, hello, thanks for joining us at BookBound 2020 From Home Literary Festival. My name is Jamie Trower, and I'm here to host the discussion between the authors Daniel Mella and Winnie M. This event has been curated in partnership with Wasafiri magazine to raise money for the UK-based mental health charity Mind. Mind provides advice and support to empower people experiencing mental health problems. Their statistics show that on average, 1 in 4 people will experience a mental health problem in a typical year, and 2020 is not a typical year. Make your donation to support mine using the link at the BookBound Just Giving page displayed below. You can find out more about BookBound, Wasafiri, Mind, and our authors by visiting our website, bookbound2020.co.uk. And now, on to our event. Daniel Mella is one of the key figures in contemporary Latin American literature. He published his first novel at just age 21, has been awarded highly for his work, winning the Bartolome Hidalgo, my apologies for mispronouncing that if I did,
Perfectly
prize.
pronounced.
Prize twice, gaining international acclaim and earning the status of a cult writer. His latest book, Older Brother, is considered by critics to be the Dostoevsky of the River Plate and is based around the death of the narrator's brother. Winnie M. is an American writer, novelist, and activist. Winnie's first novel, Dark Chapter, was released in 2017, and the book won the Guardian newspaper's Not the Booker Prize in 2017. That chapter was nominated for the Edgar Award for Best First Novel and shortlisted for the Authors Club Best First Novel Award. The book has been translated into 10 languages and has been highly praised as being brave, raw, powerful, and a must read. Hello, guys. Good to see you both.
I
How's lockdown going?
it's I mean I think it's probably different from Daniel because Uruguay doesn't seem to be as locked down, but in London we're pretty locked down, so the weather's amazing outside, but we can't really do
No.
very much. So
And
Yeah, it's not been
Daniel,
that
what
bad
about
for
you?
me. Huh?
Well, what about you? How's lockdown going?
Oh, well, the lockdowns, it's voluntary here in Uruguay, just like a voluntary quarantine. The difference is that all my work has become digital, virtual. So I'm spending a lot of more time at the computer, at home. So it's like there's a little bit too much work, but as long as you can organize your time, it's pretty good. I enjoy being at home anyway, a writer's life. You know what I mean?
Exactly. I know exactly what you mean, mate. Us writers, we love being at home, don't we?
Yeah.
um, cool. Are you guys reading anything interesting during lockdown?
I just finished Daniel's book, which is very interesting.
Yes, I agree with you there.
Here. Um,
Whoa, nice. Well, I just finished your book this morning, so yeah, congratulations on that book.
but aside from that, yeah, just kind of a combination of things. Like I'm working on my second novel, so I'm trying to read things that'll help inform that. So at the moment, I'm reading a lot of Meg Wolitzer. Her novel The Interstings is very good, and Trust Exercise by Susan Choi I've just read as well. So yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. I just got this book yesterday. Knockin' Stiff, it's called, by David Ray Pollock. I don't know if you heard about him. It's an American dude.
No, what is it about?
it's like Winesburg, Ohio, but like uh, very poor people, like like violence, incest. It's more like a sort of nasty version of Winesburg, Ohio.
Yeah. Where is it set? Is it set in Ohio or?
It's set, yeah, in a small town called Knock'emstiff, which
Okay.
seems funny
Okay.
to be, but I think it exists in real
Probably.
life.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I don't live there anymore, but yeah. Um, Jamie, did you have questions? I mean, we'll leave it to you, really. I mean,
Yeah.
So actually, I'm thinking of starting this discussion off with a quote from Daniel's book. On page 35, Daniel, you talk about conversations you would have with your father and Ali on survival.
Yeah.
Survival, you write, the inhalation of the human race and the stupidity of the human species. I also liked how Marcos, on page 37, quite poetically, I think, explains how dolphins can choose to stop breathing, a very animal trait for us humans. From that, I feel trauma victims like us,
Hmm.
um, we sit on an axis of surrender and survival. So, as humans, as artists, as activists, as writers, how would you say that you guys survive?
Hmm. You just made me think of like this all of this last month that everybody's attention seems to be on surviving.
Hmm.
I've been thinking about it a lot because it seems like when you're very worried about survival and that's your main concern, the possibilities of doing something beautiful diminish greatly. Like
Hmm.
I think that one of the things that I've maybe um, gotten from writing is precisely that. When you're writing and when you're feeling good about what you're writing and you're in that trance-like state of like creating a book and living with a book, survival like recedes to a second or third degree of importance, and I think that's where you can do your best work. And that's what pains me for like when I look around and see so many people now worrying about survival. It seems like all the possibilities for really doing something worthwhile or beautiful or creative just gets lost. So I think that like the worry for survival is like a very difficult trick to to um to come out of, sort of alive or really alive or feeling human. You know what I mean? Did I explain myself somehow?
yeah. No, I mean, it's that what is that? The hierarchy of needs, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like that.
Ah, okay.
So if it's like, kind of food, shelter, some would say sex, like all that stuff is at the bottom, and you need to be able to have that before you're able to, you know, have the livelihood and then like be able to pursue art. So, and I think, yeah, you're right. I think in lockdown, in some ways it's the ideal situation for a writer to be creating art, right? You think, because it's like, oh my God, like we're shut indoors and we're just surrounded by books and like there's nothing else to do. But
Hmm.
I guess there is so much kind of sort of anxiety about what's happening in the world right now. I mean, and even I've been ill for about 6 weeks with what's probably a mild version of COVID, but it's just kind of been ongoing and it's kind of annoying. But you think about people that have it probably much worse than me, and people that have relatives or themselves are on the brink of survival. And I mean, there's no space in that kind of situation to be able to write or to create art. So I think, yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I think it's hard to pursue the arts at the moment if there's so much precarity around you. But I guess in terms of your question, Jamie, I mean, I sort of interpreted it like survival means different things at different points along the journey, I suppose, right? So
Yeah.
for me, I mean, Dark Chapter it's a fictional retelling of my own rape, which happened in real life. So you know, when you're being assaulted, there is very much a question of survival, and you know that kind of fight or flight mechanism kicks in, and it is very much about like, am I actually literally going to survive this assault, this kind of physical violence that's being suddenly visited upon you? So that's one form of survival, and the kind of that part of the brain kicks in where it's literally just like you're not even thinking, you're just kind of automatically doing stuff that enables you to survive somehow. And so that was kind of what survival meant for me, you know, during like the immediate moments of the assault. But then the weeks and the months after that, it's a different kind of survival, right? Because you're not actually, your life actually isn't being threatened in the months, the 9 months or the 10 months or the 2 years after the assault, but you're kind of being forced to relive it because of post-traumatic stress disorder. So that's a different kind of survival. You somehow have to survive this ongoing, repeated trauma, you know, which your memory doesn't let you go of, doesn't allow you to let go of. So I think like that's survival in a different way, because you have to kind of figure out how to confront that trauma, and some people do it through art, some people do it through writing, some people just do it through therapy, who knows, but that's a different form of survival in terms of how do you live the day to day when, you know, you're not actually afraid of dying, but you're afraid of that memory that's constantly being forced upon you. And so that takes a different kind of skill, I suppose. And
Winnie,
people say it's not a skill, right? It's
do
time.
you feel that writing the book helped you survive?
No, because I didn't start writing the book until 5 years after the assault. So I had this like long period after the assault of, well, the legal situation, and then, you know, just having really bad PTSD and depression and anxiety. And then I had to figure out how to rebuild my life. And it was only until I got to a point where I had a new job, I was financially secure again, that was when I was able to write the book as the novel. So, and I guess that goes back to the hierarchy of needs, right? Because it was when I no longer was actually afraid of my own life, when I no longer was being chased by those memories, when I had a new place and I like was earning decent money, that's when I felt secure enough as a human being to be able to pursue the writing itself. So I don't know. I mean, what was that like for you in terms of? I'm curious about how soon after your brother's death were you able to start writing it or approaching it as the way that you did as a writer?
Well, I was at the beginning, I was just writing down sort of feelings and you know, but in a very chaotic way. I wasn't like just writing a book or anything. I always found writing to be like a way in which I can think better and even feel more clearly, you know. So as long as I'm writing, I sort of know where I am. And but then 6 months after the death of my brother, uh, it just sort of came to me. I remembered that morning where when my brother had died, that we were sitting with my mother in the porch, like in the first scene of the book, and my mother said, why did your brother have to die when he was like such a happy person? You know what I mean? When there's other people who keep bitching about life and complaining and only see the bad side. And I didn't answer anything that morning, but when I remembered it 6 months later, I said, what would have happened if I had said, "Oh, you're right. It should have been me. You know, it should have been me, the one who died." And that's where I realized, like, there was something I hadn't said, and that there was like this feeling of guilt that I was actually carrying inside, but wouldn't admit to myself. So by writing what hadn't happened, by allowing what I hadn't said to be said on a piece of paper, now I had a book. Like, now I had a structure. Now I had like an opening to my own true feelings, and I could start actually making a fiction out of it, because the narrator was saying something I didn't say. So in a way, it's a lie. In a way, it's fiction, and that's like basically the mechanism that allowed me. And it did. I do feel it was a way of coping with it. You know, like coping with the sadness or the grief.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm. So, why would you both say that and you probably just answered it in a way, but how would you both say, like, why fiction? Why not memoir? Why not non-fiction?
I mean, for me, I had, like I said before, I had 5 years between the assault and starting to write it. So during those 5 years, I had a lot of time to think about sexual assault, sexual violence, and, you know, why it happens. And, you know, it was certainly one of those things that I never expected to have happen to me in my life. But then it did, right? I was out in a park. I mean, for those who haven't read my book, I was out in a park in the middle of the day, and I was followed by a stranger who raped and assaulted me quite violently. So that it was one of those like really random occurrences, as random as, you know, lightning striking, you know, a lifeguard, right, Daniel? So it's, I mean, it's the randomness of the occurrence that changes your life fundamentally, which was just, I couldn't really make sense of it, right? So that took a while to just kind of deal with on my own, I guess through therapy and just through kind of recovery. So I guess, yeah, sorry, what was the original question? I just kind of want to get
Well, basically, like, why fiction?
yeah,
Why not non-fiction?
here's that link, right? So during that time, I ended up reading a lot of memoirs by other rape survivors, right? So, because again, I couldn't really make sense of it. So suddenly I sort of turned to books, right? And there's a number of really great memoirs. Lucky by Alice Sebold and After Silence by Nancy Venable Rain, are two off the top of my head, by survivors who are writers who similarly were raped by strangers, and it's those memoirs are very powerful, and they're very much about surviving the rape and the aftermath. So I read a number of memoirs, and I felt like that had already sort of been done. Like other writers had written really good memoirs about surviving a rape and the aftermath, and I wanted to do something new. So that's why I wrote it as fiction, because for me, sort of the key to trying to make sense of the whole strangeness of it was trying to understand why my perpetrator had done that, which I'm never going to know because he's a stranger, right? But he was a 15-year-old boy at the time that he assaulted me. So that automatically throws up a whole bunch of questions. You know, what had happened to that boy in his 15 years of living that had caused him to be so violent? What made him think he could just do that to a stranger that he saw in the park? So I wanted to write it as fiction so I could imagine the rape and everything that came before and everything that came after through his point of view. And I knew obviously you can't do that as memoir, you can't do that as nonfiction. So fiction allowed me a certain kind of freedom as an artist to take this horrible thing that happened to me and transform it into something for me which was more productive. And it just kind of gave me some more mastery over a situation where, you know, the very definition of sexual assault, sexual violence is that you have no control over it. Suddenly I had control over it, and in a weird way I had control over the character who was my perpetrator. So it was a strange kind of puppetry, I suppose. So for me, I wanted sort of the creative challenge of turning it into fiction. And if I'd done it as straight memoir, I think it would have been, you know, interesting as well, but probably would have been too sad because I would have just been writing from my own perspective. And I wanted to at least be able to construct another character who was probably more interesting for me because I wasn't forced to relive. It wasn't just my own experience. It was something new. It was kind of more unexplored territory for me.
Yeah, for me it was just from the beginning, from the get-go. I had that image, that memory, which I sort of perverted and changed. So from the beginning I knew it was sort of laid out that it was going to be a fictional account. And maybe the fiction is not necessarily making up stuff, but just taking, you know, like something out of context, something that actually happened, but making somebody else do it, something somebody said, you know. So it's just moving pieces around that makes it a fictional account, basically. And like the compression of time.
Yeah.
Because a lot of things I make happen in a couple of days that actually maybe happened in a span of a year and a half or 2 years. And I felt that gave me also like an actual freedom, because of the people involved. Like if it was going to be nonfiction, I would have had to be faithful to the events and sort of to the people involved.
Yeah.
but the novel sort of starts having its own demands and giving you its own structure, you know, and telling you where to go. So it's sort of it's very easy to start discarding the things that you should have said if it were going to be a non-fictional account, because you have to be faithful to the actual event. But if it's a novel, then what doesn't fit in there in that structure just falls off and is not necessary. So I felt like it was a blessing for it to come as a novel, because it sort of gave me the actual shape, the form in which I could tell that story. Because if not, I think I would have maybe spent years and years filling pages and pages, because there's so many things to say, you know what I mean, that you could say. But I think the novel just like structured it and gave me like a sort of firm ground where to stand on, you know, and feel like more stable, more secure.
Yeah, I mean, you said it, and I said too, like, you have more freedom, and I think, you know, and there's less, like, with nonfiction, there's a certain accountability to people that are alive, and to people, and there's a certain ethical responsibility as well, right? And with fiction, you know, you can do whatever the hell you want in some ways, and just say, and because it's fiction, you don't have to feel like you're representing things as they actually happened, or people as they actually were. Yeah, I mean, for me, obviously, quite a lot of the things that happen in Dark Chapter are based on real life. Like, everything that happened to Vivian, for the most part, happened to me, but I rearranged the order because it has more dramatic impact if certain events fall in a certain order. Some characters I conflated into one, you know. The one thing that I completely created was the court scene. There's a trial which happens where the perpetrator is on trial for the rape, and that didn't happen in real life, because in real life my perpetrator pleaded guilty. But you know, narratively that kind of falls flat if you have a crime that happens and then this kind of chase afterwards where they're trying to find the criminal, and then they find the criminal and then he pleads guilty. Like, it's not as narratively kind of satisfying as having the big showdown take place in a court case, right? So I created the court case. I just sort of imagined how it would have been. And again, if I was writing nonfiction, I couldn't have done that. So I guess to satisfy kind of what we expect from narrative, that's why I decided to use fiction, because that, you know, you owe it on some hand, if you're writing about real life, to reflect kind of the reality of what happened, but then if you're using fiction, then you also owe your readers to have a satisfying read in some ways, or to have something that fits our expectations of narrative a bit better.
I thought it was really impressive how in your book you managed to speak from the point of view of the rapist, and how you were able to sort of make him into a real life, like, living, breathing character. You know what I mean? He's not just like some archetypal criminal. He is his own person. You know what I mean? And I thought that it blew my mind, because what kind of imaginative effort, but also emotional investment do you have to make in order to make the perpetrator, you know, like a real person in a page? Like, it takes time, it takes emotion, it takes some kind of like really brave sort of commitment to the craft. So I was wondering, like, what was that experience like for you? Because you could have made him into like a cardboard character, two-dimensional.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, and I think that's, I mean, it kind of speaks to what, you know, if certainly, like, you know, #MeToo, look at all the stories that have been coming out about sexual violence. You know, there is, I think, you know, for the longest time, we've had a tendency to think like rapists are, I mean, and obviously the things they do are monstrous, but there's a tendency to think they're like these monsters who live on the other side of this wall of humanity. But I mean, to be honest, you know, rape is committed by a number of people. You know, we probably actually know people who have committed it, you know, but just nobody actually like confesses it, right? It's just, it's a very widespread crime, and you know, any form of criminal is a three-dimensional human being, right? So I think there's a tendency to automatically want to make the rapist that like shadowy figure in the bushes who breathes hard in a movie. But at the end of the day, for me, I always wanted, you know, my vision for the book was I always wanted to tell the story of a rape equally from the point of view of the victim and the perpetrator. And so I knew my experience really well, obviously, so I didn't have to do any research there. But for me, the book wasn't going to work if half of the story is being told by a cardboard figure or somebody who's like a stock villain. So I had to make him three-dimensional. And I think for me, the key was just the fact that he was so young. You know, to be honest, I think if he had been, you know, my age or older, I might not have even been interested enough in the story to try to create him as a character. But because he was a 15-year-old boy, again, as I said, lots of questions about what his life had been like. And, you know, and there is a certain sadness to it. I mean, I think when you're dealing with any story of violence, there's a sadness at the heart of it, because what drives somebody to be that violent, I mean, I don't know personally, but, you know, there is grief, and, you know, that violence has to take root in something. So for me, I wanted to try to imagine a young boy who, you know, maybe hadn't had a great life, and maybe he'd witnessed some forms of violence, and maybe that had led him to committing the kind of violence he did. Obviously, he had certain ideas about women and girls as well. So the kind of misogyny that pervades our society, or certain kinds of societies, I wanted to look at. So, but I guess the key to trying to make him human was to try to imagine him being quite vulnerable himself. So it was important for me to imagine, you know, what was he like when he was 2 years old and, you know, pretty innocent, right? How did he learn these kinds of attitudes towards women? And, you know, he's not treated well by his family. So there's a sense of he's been betrayed by his family and by his community as well. So, and I kind of had to give him a sense of humor. And for me, it was just like, it did take a certain amount of commitment, but it was actually just more interesting kind of creatively to try to imagine somebody who was so different from my own experience, from my own world. You know, I live in a nice middle class educated world, right? You know, so I don't encounter people from, you know, that have had particularly bad childhoods. So I kind of wanted to imagine what that was like. Yeah, and like it, you know, in some ways, that was more interesting for me than retelling the story of my own like life, really. So yeah, but it did take a lot of commitment, and I'm not doing it in my next novel. Like I may in the future, but yeah. But anyway, but thank you, Daniel. I appreciate that.
No.
Yeah.
Daniel, I was quite interested in how you like traveled through your narrative in the different use of tense.
Yeah.
You mixed up the forms of time, making a trauma that was, well, that is a future occurrence itching itself to happen, and also a present occurrence. So it's sort of like a cloud of grief. Was there any like specific reason for doing that?
Yeah, at the beginning, it was a very simple reason. I was getting a little tired and bored of the whole text. I was writing it all in the past tense. And suddenly I started feeling like it was getting like a little boring and slow. So I was like, what can I do about this? So I was like, I'm just gonna put some things in the present and others in the past. And then it was still like really hard to grind through it. And then it just sort of came to me. It actually happened when I remembered a scene in which my father went to pick up my brother's body, and they were keeping him in sort of the police station of the beach resort where he died. And my father had been in that police station when he was young,
Yeah.
in that same building. So he sort of had a flashback and saw himself as a young man in that place. And now his young son was dead in that same place. He'd been there 40 years before. And I thought, like, time just collapses in these moments of trauma, you know what I mean? In these moments where something unexpected like that happens. And I started realizing that maybe it was like the perfect sort of strategy to demonstrate that or to show that suddenly we had entered a kind of vortex where time was just, you know, gone awry, and there was like a chaos of past, present, future. At the beginning, I wasn't sure it was going to work, but the more I wrote in that way, like speaking of the past as in the future tense, the more it started sort of making sense. And I think it ends up being like, but I didn't know what I was doing. That's what also I loved about it. Like at the beginning, I didn't know why I was doing that. It was basically, I'm just bored and I want to switch it up a little bit. And then it sort of started revealing itself, like the meaning it had. You know what I mean? I didn't have an access to it, like logically thinking to begin with.
Yeah, but you do that again quite beautifully at the end, at the very end of your book. There's this tree that you describe, and you're kind of mixing up like present, what's happening, and there's something quite shocking happens. And in the wake of that, you're walking your two sons towards this tree, but then you're intertwining that with your own memories of you and your brother playing on that tree. And that's, you know, yeah, and I thought that was done quite beautifully, because it's, you know, I mean, so you know, your book is about family and just kind of the circularity of generation and kind of ghosts of generations overlapping upon each other. So, and, you know, and brotherhood and fatherhood and all that. So I thought, yeah, the way that you mix up tenses and also kind of intertwined kind of this past and present and memory and what's happening in a moment really well. So, yeah.
Oh, thanks. I'm glad you liked it. I thought people are not gonna understand anything. You know what I mean? At the beginning, I thought this is like some silly trick I'm trying to play on people. But I think it's like, I'm happy to see that it actually works. Like it makes me kind of trust the writing process. You know what I mean? Because you discover stuff as you write. You know, you discover the shape of what you're writing, because it sort of is revealed while you are writing it and not like previously. So I think that's maybe like one of the things that this book sort of confirmed and taught me again, was like, just trust the writing process, you know, and let it sort of tell you what to do, and just think about it later, you know, after you've done it, or after you've given those strategies that surge like a chance.
Yeah, but also like trust your readers, because I think, you know, if you follow convention, there's, you know, there's a convention of, you know, a third person past tense, right? You know, which obviously, you know, Dark Chapter is written in present tense, but I mean, I started writing in past tense, and then I was just like, well, I want to make it present tense because I want it to feel more immediate. And at one point I slip into first person around the time of the assault, and then back out. But you know, if you stick to, there's this convention, but like of third person past tense, but it's, you know, you don't have to follow it. And like, if you, like,
True.
if you write in like future tense, like, I mean, you have to, you know, trust that the reader will still understand what's happening, or even if they get a little bit confused, it's more about the atmosphere that writing in a different tense creates. So yeah, no, I think I might try to write in future tense or something, but I really like the idea of playing with tenses, because it confuses the reader, but I think readers like to be like confused a bit, or they like to be kind of you know, like put on edge, so they're thinking, wait, what's happening here, you know, because I think that makes the reading process more interesting for them.
Writing in the future tense has like a sort of a poetic quality of its own. It's like, I don't know what it is exactly, but I remember the first time I was really aware of reading something in the future that I really liked is a story by Ted Chiang, which is called Story of Your Life.
Oh yeah, the one that became Arrival, the film Arrival.
The one that became Arrival.
Yeah.
That's one of my favorite stories in my life. And he uses the future tense to talk about the future.
Yeah.
But it's beautiful, because it's like, there's like this sort of prophetic quality about it, and a sort of longing, a sort of like a weird inverted melancholy.
Yeah.
Mixed with anxiety. I don't know. It's beautiful.
Yeah, no, I should read it. I mean, I thought the film was amazing, but
oh, the story is incredible. One of my favorite stories ever.
Really? Okay. I'm gonna read it.
Yeah. I actually quite like what you just said, Daniel, about it tenses being oddly poetic. and because I'm a poet, I did notice like the poetic fluency of your use of tense, and how wonderful I thought it was from a poetic perspective and from a reading perspective.
Thank you.
Uh, Winnie,
Hmm.
do you think there has been a difference in regards to the reading and reception of Dark Chapters since it was first published, maybe from the Me Too movement and a bigger discussion in society surrounding sexual assault and rape?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely bigger discussion happening. I mean, the Dark Chapter, the British edition came out in June of 2017, and then the US edition, which was released by a quite small press, was released that came out in September of 2017, and then Weinstein allegations came to light in October. So I guess you can say that the American edition kind of coincided with the Weinstein allegations. So I mean, you can say I was lucky, and that the timing was good. If the book came out like 2 years prior to that, it may not have gotten as much attention. If I was trying to submit the book and get it sold to publishers after Me Too, I probably would have gotten a bigger deal, right? So from an industry perspective, we struggled when we were submitting to publishers because they said it was too upfront in the way it represented sexual violence, and people can't handle that, right? Which is in some ways ridiculous because it happens, right? Sexual violence happens, and you don't, what do you want to sugarcoat it, right? I mean, it's a trauma that happens to a lot of people, and it's important to tell that trauma honestly and openly. So I mean, I think the book, hopefully, and people tell me, it has said that it's helped to open up a wider conversation about it. But I mean, it's not the only thing that's done that. There's lots of other books out there, and obviously there's all the people that came and told their stories about Weinstein and Bill Cosby and a number of other figures. So but what's been really interesting is to have the book come out around the time of Me Too. And Me Too it's still happening. It's no longer the big hashtag in the media anymore because people just care about coronavirus. But these issues of patriarchy and gender-based violence continue to this day. They're probably during lockdown they're even worse. It's I think there's been a lot of really interesting events. And people have said that it's changed their understanding of sexual violence. Rape is one of those things where you don't ever really think it's going to happen to you, and then it does happen to you, and then you're like, oh yeah, all those stories I heard before, nothing quite prepares you for this, right? So people that haven't had that experience have read it and said, well, it's given me a better understanding of what my sister went through at the time. And certainly I've had men that have read it that have thought twice then again about speaking to a woman in a certain way, or just really basic things like if you're a woman, the fear that you have of going down a dark alleyway at night is something a lot of men don't feel. So for me, being able to bring that fear and that kind of anxiety to life a bit, and allow male readers to get an insight into that experience has been good. But yeah, I mean, the conversation has definitely opened up. And I'm hoping that with coronavirus and COVID-19 and the lockdown, we're not going to forget about those issues because it continues to be a problem for a lot of women around the world, and men as well. Men are also equally a part of the equation. They can be victims as well of sexual violence, and they're also frequently the perpetrators. So there's that whole cycle of culpability and accountability that needs to be constantly brought into question. So I hope, with literature, with my book, and with other kinds of books and movies out there, that conversation can persist. Sorry, that was a very PR answer. I'm sorry.
Don't apologize. It was a good answer. It is a very, very big topic, and it needs to be talked about all the time. And it is such a big problem around the world. And
yeah, and it's one of those things where it's like, oh, it had its day in the media. It's like, well, not really, So I'd be curious to know,
it's
2
still
years
happening
from now, hopefully 2 years from now, COVID-19 isn't going to be the big hashtag. Will people still be thinking about issues of Me Too, or will we have kind of had a regression in some ways? So who knows? But as long as people keep on reading and talking about it, I think that's one way forward.
Yeah, definitely. Um, This question is to both of you. What have you both used to heal since your trauma?
I'd say time. I haven't used time, but time happens. I mean, I guess this goes back to the conversation.
Time is everywhere.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's that phrase, which may be a bit cliched, that time heals all wounds, but I mean, it kind of does in some ways. Obviously, traumas like sexual violence, like they can be recurring, in that even if it's something that happened to you once, the memory of it can recur when you least expect it. But yeah, I mean, yeah, time, because like things happen in the intervening time, and I guess for me after my assaults, part of me just wanted to like do as many things as I could, despite the PTSD, to kind of put more space between the trauma and where I was in my current point in life. So I was like doing all this traveling the year after my assault, which is a bit nuts looking back on it now, but I was just trying to like create more memories and more positive memories that could kind of sort of eclipse the other one. It's not necessarily the best thing to do, but like, I guess time allows you to experience other things, and with the experience of other things, other more positive things, that trauma kind of then recedes into the distance a little bit. So I'd say that's one thing.
Yeah. I feel like obviously, yes, time and relationships, like brothers, sisters, parents, children, friends. Like I found a lot of help, like because like grieving together, allowing yourself to grieve with your friends, with your loved ones, like not holding back, allowing yourself to be a little bit more naked and available, because you can't do it alone. I think that's one of the things that maybe you wish you could, but there's a point where you have to sort of be able to ask for help and also lend your hand for the ones who are in your own same process. I think it's like so universal in a way and so necessary. Like I feel like my brother's death was like in a weird way, somebody dies, and at least for a couple of days they give you a sort of gift, which is suddenly, because of the impact of that person's disappearing, sort of you see the priorities straight. You know what I mean? Like for a couple of days at least, you realize, okay, work is not really that important. You know what I mean? Like paying the bills, okay, not that important right now. And sort of, so you're left with what's really substantial to your life. And so if, like I always thought since my brother died, like how am I gonna honor his death? Like I'm gonna try to sort of be a little bit more aware of how fleeting everything is, and try to like pay more attention to like the basic and the fundamental stuff, which is, I don't know, the well-being of the ones around me, including myself. So I think that time and relationships,
Yeah, and like that, big traumas like that. I mean, like that help to put everything into perspective, right? Because I remember things that I would get quite worried or anxious about prior to the assault, and afterwards I was like, whatever, right? I mean, like everything pales in comparison to having been, for me at the time, everything paled in comparison to having been violently assaulted and raped by strangers. So like, why am I getting worried about all these other things? So I think it's, I mean, I guess it's allowed me to build some resilience, but I sort of no longer really sweat the small stuff, because I'm just like, well, at the end of the day, it's kind of minor details compared to trying to survive something like that. Yeah, and it does make you really value the things in life that matter, right? So likewise, after my own assault, it was kind of I didn't tell my parents for a number of reasons until years later, but it was the support of friends that really made it possible. And even now, I suppose a lot of the activism I do is around building that community of survivors and people that don't really maybe feel other people can understand what they're going through. But I think once we start realizing how many people are suffering from the impact of sexual violence, then you kind of find that community and you're able to no longer have to sit through silence. So I think that's important. And also, you know, at the moment now, I have a 4-month-old baby who miraculously we can't hear at the moment because he's in the other room. But I mean, there's certain things in life that I didn't actually think I'd ever be able to experience because of the assault. And then in the past year and a half, I like suddenly met someone and now I got a baby in the middle of a pandemic. I mean, so it's kind of like all these like other weird things happen, and you kind of have to trust that life is just going to throw other weird things your way, and some of them are going to be positive. But at the end of the day, you don't really have that much control over what happens or what comes your way, really. So some things are going to be terrible and other things will be good, and you just kind of have to sort of go with it. Yeah.
Congratulations on your baby.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks. Yeah.
How is it a girl or a boy?
It's a boy. Yeah.
It's a boy.
Yeah.
How old is he?
4 months. Yeah.
Oh my God.
So I was already in quarantine when COVID-19
So
happened. Now I'm like, oh.
So you're not going to be sleeping for about a year and a half or so, right?
Yeah, I mean, he's actually a pretty good sleeper, but I mean, obviously still not getting a normal amount of sleep. So yeah, so it's kind of a weird scenario to be raising a 4-month-old baby in the middle of a pandemic. I have no idea when he's going to get to meet someone other than my partner and me. There are other people in the world; they do exist, but yeah.
I definitely vibe with what you guys are saying about like life throwing weird, just really tragic things, really traumatic things, but also like really weird things that sort of like surprising. Because when I was 9, I skied into a rock and I was in a coma for a very long time and stuff like that. And that was a very traumatic experience for me, and especially for the family. They're all saints. I owe them so much. But yeah, just life has like uh in it got me skiing into a rock, got me in a coma for a while, and then so like the result of that trauma has been like such a roller coaster, you know, and it's though the traumatic experiences are traumatic, that still as us writers, they definitely um give us fuel for the fire, you know. Yeah. Um uh so um I suppose it's quite reassuring to others that sorry, I'm gonna reword that question. I'm getting a bit muddled. Um do you have any advice for writers who have gone through similar experiences and need to put it down on paper?
Yeah, I mean, put it down on paper or a computer screen, right? And in some ways, don't worry at the beginning about what other people are going to think, because at the end of the day, like as a writer, you know, you're writing for yourself, like that, you know. I mean, there's different kinds of writing. Obviously there's, you know, very commercial writing, but you know, I think it's certainly when you're dealing with something like trauma, something that you've lived through, like the first person you're writing for is yourself, right? And at some point that may turn into something else, that may turn into a novel, that may, you know, or it may turn into, you know, whatever, like graphic literature. It may turn into a short story, it may turn into a poem, but writing serves a purpose for you, right? And that's your self-expression. And then later on down the line, you know, you might turn it into something else, but it's you don't want to get kind of suffocated by the fear of what other people are going to think, because you don't have to show it to anyone to begin with, right? It may just be for yourself, and then you can shape it to something later on. So I'd say don't get choked at the beginning worrying about what other people are gonna think, because it's for you, right? That's
Yeah.
advice. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the same, and I think it's also connected to trusting the reader, like you said before, Winnie,
Yeah.
and trusting that your experience, if you will find like a reflection or will echo in somebody else's heart, because your experience, like, trust that your individual experience is universal.
Yeah.
You know, even when you might be ashamed of your feelings or reactions or actions, like, try to remind yourself that people will find, maybe even in those apparently shameful reactions, they will find themselves, and they will feel identified, and they will feel like, you know, sometimes you want to hide the anger or the guilt that you feel because of the pain or because of the loss of a dear one, and you would like to pretend like your sadness was pure, you know, and that you were um, this um, perfectly sad, loving person, but you're not. It's all mixed up sometimes, and just allow yourself to say everything that's in your heart, to say it in a way, you know, because there's nothing to be ashamed about. That's what I mean, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think people are drawn to honesty. It's like, it's kind of, the more authentic your writing is, the more it will resonate with people. And somewhere later on down the line, you can turn it into fiction if you want. But at the end of the day, it's don't don't be worried about the artifice or the craft of writing at the very beginning. I don't think.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's important. Like for me, like writing, you asked about survival, Jamie, like writing is survival for me. I mean, and it has been. It's how I make sense of the world, right? I can't really function if I can't write in some ways. So, and there's a lot of writing I do, which I never want to show anyone, right? Because that's just for me. So yeah, it's important, if for any writer out there, to just keep writing, because for some of us, it's like breathing, really.
Mm. Very wise words. Very wise words. Now I believe we have some questions on Twitter. Thank you, Twitter people and Facebook people. Okay, the first question is from Facebook, I think. Um, Coping mechanisms. What coping mechanisms, Winnie, uh, did you use through writing about your trauma?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be curious to hear this from Daniel as well. I mean, I guess for me, I didn't write about, well, okay, in some ways, there's lots of writing I did about the assaults, which was just for me to see, and that was like random, like fragments that I was writing, around the time and in the intervening years. But then the actual writing of the novel, I didn't write until 5 years. I didn't start until 5 years after. The weird thing is that the prologue to the novel, which I wrote, which is written in kind of a bizarre tense. It's written in future, looking back on what happened 2 years ago. So it was written in a kind of imagined future, looking back on the moment just before the assaults. I actually wrote that like a few weeks after the assault in real life. So I kind of wrote it, and I wrote it in that weird tense. And then I just remember thinking, like, that's pretty good writing, right? I'm like, oh, that's pretty good. And I'm like, I'm going to turn that into a book. But I sort of knew I wasn't going to be in the right state to write that book until like years down the line, right? So I just like saved it on my computer. I sent it to some friends. They were all like, oh, it's good. I'm like, yeah, cool. And then I like saved it, and I'm like, I'll turn that into a book somewhere down the line. So I guess one of my coping mechanisms was to not actually try to write that book until I was ready for it, right? And I couldn't have written it the year after the assault. I couldn't have written it 2 years after. I had to be in the right state in my life to be able to write it. So that was kind of a long-term coping mechanism. And I guess shorter term, it was like day to day when I was writing it, especially if I was dealing with the really hard emotional stuff. When I was writing Vivian sections and trying to recreate like the absolute sadness and kind of destruction that she felt after the assault, that was pretty heavy for me to write. So I would break down in tears when I was writing it. So I would just stop, you know, I'd be like, okay, you know, I'm done writing for today, and I'd go off and like watch a movie or something like that, right? So it's the same way that you kind of deal with the trauma itself, is just that, you know, you have to give yourself breaks and be kind to yourself. So yeah, so that would be another coping mechanism, just being kind to yourself and allowing yourself the space to write it at a pace that's manageable for you as a writer.
Yeah, I felt that writing was a way of coping with with the situation for me, and I also felt like writing that book was like, that book that was being written was something that was being born from my brother's death. You know, like when a tree falls in the forest and something else grows out of that, of the dead wood. I thought, okay, so maybe this is one of the things that's going to be born from my brother's death. So I sort of treated it as that, and I that sort of comforted me in a way. You know, okay, here's something that's being created out of death, which apparently is such a, like, the end of all, but apparently it isn't. I felt like it also made me be in touch with my brother in a different way. You know, suddenly my brother was dead, and now I had like to relate to him in more subtle ways. And writing was one of them. I remember I got stuck in the middle of the book, not in the middle, like 3/4, and couldn't continue. And I didn't know how to continue. And I got super depressed, couldn't write for a month, didn't know where to go. And I had a dream with my brother where my brother told me, remember all the things you didn't like about me. And I thought, wow. Suddenly he sort of allowed me to actually talk about the things I hated about him, or how much I competed with him, or, you know, all that sort of real feelings that happened between two brothers. You know, I could actually not make him, like, he allowed me not to make him into a hero. You know, he allowed me to show him as what I perceived him to be, with all his flaws and all my flaws. So I also felt like it was actually like I was written, like the book was being written by him and me. So then, like, actually having a conversation with the dead, which had never happened to me so strongly before. In a way, you're always having conversations with the dead when you're writing, but this was very specific and necessary for me.
Cool. Yeah. It's as though your brother had given you like permission to write.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
the book couldn't have been written without him dying. For some time, I felt a kind of guilt, like, wow, so my brother had to die for me to write this book. Like, this is a book that would have been impossible without my brother's death. And I felt like in that book, I was, like, for the first time as never before, I was being allowed to speak of a lot of things that had been stored up in myself for such a long time. And just like my brother's death was like this door that just flew open, and suddenly I had access to all this stuff. So it was like a weird sense of gratitude, and mixed with pain and guilt. But thank God for writing.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Definitely. Amen. So this again is for both of you. To prepare your writing about personal Sorry, I worded that question wrong. We're gonna try again. To prepare your writing about personal trauma and like working through it, did it change every time you like went back to the draft?
I mean, I think even if you're not writing about trauma, it changes every
Yeah,
time you write a
yeah,
draft. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, in some ways, there's an interesting metaphor there because, like, you know, if you're working on a long form piece of writing, like that's constantly changing, right? Even short form stuff, right? But like a piece of writing is like in some ways never complete. Like, I mean, fine, it'll get published, but I think even when things are
yeah,
published, you still want to change it afterwards, right? And similarly, like, you know, experiencing trauma and the aftermath of that, it's never static, right? It's always changing. And if you're recovering from an assault or if you're dealing with a bereavement, like some days you think you're better and then the next day you're worse, right? So it's kind of like me and COVID-19 at the moment, right? We're kind of what we're dealing with right now, you know, in terms of the uncertainty of things. So yeah, like sometimes the draft would change, but I guess I kind of was aware of the fact that you know everything was going to be a process. And there was, in terms of like the specifics of Dark Chapter, I mean there was a whole entire section at the end that I wrote which had to get cut out, right? So I think I lost about 30,000 words which I'd written, and that, I mean, my editor had wanted just to end it shortly after the assault, because sorry, not after the assault, after the trial, because that's a more traditional kind of Hollywood narrative. But for me, I wanted to continue because I was like, well, I mean, in real life, like, you know, it's not like everything's over once you have a legal result. Like, I mean, first of all, a lot of people don't even have a trial for the perpetrator, right? But in real life, you know, it's not like once the result happens, from the court, you know, everything's wonderful, right? Like, if anything, that, like, for me, the process of recovering began once that legal process was over. So I wanted to show that much longer story of recovery and the fact that it takes 5-10 years to recover from something like a rape. But my editors were like, yeah, well, that's too long. So you have to cut it. So there is that sense that, you know, for a commercial product like a novel, which is going to get mass produced, you have to put a frame around it somehow. But, you know, the experience of living it never finishes, right, in some ways. So I guess you just have to be aware of the fact the draft is going to continue changing, and even some things I would have liked to keep, I wasn't allowed to keep by my editors. So yeah, but at the end of the day, a draft ideally, for the way I write, is it ideally shrinks. So like the first version I wrote was like 200,000 words, and the published version ended up being 110,000, because it's kind of just like, I don't know, it's like cooking a sauce and allowing it to simmer, and it gets more and more condensed, and the condensed stuff is the good stuff, right? You don't want all the other watery bits. So yeah, for me, there was an awareness of the fact that the draft was going to change, but that's the writing process, and that's kind of like life in some ways, right? So
Yeah, it changes. It changes all the time. Like as long as you're right, at least in my experience, as long as I'm writing something, it sort of mutates all the time. In this particular case with older brother, there was a little difference though, and I think it also had to do with the fact that I was writing about my brother or with my brother. He was a musician, and he had like a different attitude from mine. Like I'm quite a perfectionist usually, you know, and I sort of correct and overcorrect. And my brother with his music was a little more free in a sense. Like he welcomed imperfection in his recordings. You know what I mean? Like the fact that the sound wasn't exactly perfect didn't bother him. For him, it was like, well, that was the moment when it was recorded, and that's what's valuable, the spirit of the moment. So as soon as I felt the book was finished, I sort of said, okay, I'm not going to overcorrect it. I'm just going to read it through once, and then I'm just going to let go. You know, like for the first time in my life, I'm not going to spend 3 months checking page by page, paragraph by paragraph. I'm just going to allow imperfection to be more of a part of this book. You know, I'm going to welcome the fact that it's, you know, asymmetric as in part welcoming the spirit of my brother into that work. And I felt like quite a release, you know, like quite a relief in that sort of acceptance. So I didn't work so much after I thought it was more or less, you know, decent. I was like, okay, just gonna let it go. Not gonna look back.
Yeah, that's great. Wow.
Yeah, it was pretty
We should
cool.
adopt that mentality sometimes, though. Yeah, there's something quite liberating about that.
Totally. I would like for that to be my philosophy from now on. I still fall into the perfectionist mode very, very easily, but
Yeah.
hoping to climb out of it.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard not to be if you're a writer, because the nature of the art is that it's there, it's on the page. So, I mean, the only way you can experience it is by reading it. And if you're reading your own writing, you're always like, oh, that word doesn't work and that doesn't work. And I have to shift that around. Whereas with music, you perform it and you either gets recorded or it doesn't get recorded, and it's just done, right? So it's sort of the permanence of the text is an enslavement in its own way, right? Because you're always being faced with the text and thinking about ways that you can improve it. So, yeah.
Totally.
Okay, guys. I think we're just up to time. With our little chat is over.
It's been a
so
pleasure, Jamie.
my
Winnie.
heart, guys. Thank you so much. This has been so fun to talk to you both. I love your works, and you're both amazing writers. And this is so cool. Yeah, this has been really cool just talking to you.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for the invitation. Winnie, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Daniel. Hopefully we'll meet in real life someday. But I mean, it's the first kind of multi-time zone literary festival conversation I've had. Really
Yeah. No, it's 5 in the morning. I feel fresh.
Oh my God.
I feel ready to go. And next time you guys are down in New Zealand, we should totally hang. We should hang out, have a barbecue or something.
Oh yeah.
Cool. Thank you so much to Daniel and Winnie and everyone at home for joining BookBound 2020 for this event. There are lots of great events like this on our program. Search for BookBound 2020 on Twitter and Instagram to learn more and help us spread the word using the hashtag BookBound 2020. Yeah. If you'd like to buy any of our works, the links in the links in the text below this video will take you through to Hive. I see you laughing, Daniel. See you having a chuckle. It's all going downhill from here, trust me. I kept my composure whilst I was asking the questions and answering. Oh God. If you'd like to buy any of our works, the links in the text below this video will take you through to Hive, an online bookseller which supports independent bookshops. Woohoo! Links to books discussed here, and the discount code on selected festival titles are below. You will also find our authors' favorite independent bookshops across the globe. You can also find the Just Giving link to donate to our chosen charities supporting mental health. Mind below. Thank you very much. And cool. That's us.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Good.